Hello friends, Story Peddler here. We return to The Hiding Place by Corrie Ten Boom. We begin with Chapter 2, Full Table. It was 1898 and I was 6 years old. Betsy stood me in front of the wardrobe mirror and gave me a lecture. Just look at your shoes. You've missed every other button. And those old torn stockings on your very first day at school. See how nice Noli looks. Noli and I shared this bedroom at the top of the bayou. I looked at my 8-year-old sister. Sure enough, her high-buttoned shoes were neatly fastened. Reluctantly, I pulled off mine while Betsy rummaged in the wardrobe. At 13, Betsy seemed almost an adult to me. Of course, Betsy had always seemed older because she couldn't run and roughhouse the way other children did. Betsy had been born with pernicious anemia, and so while the rest of us played tag or bowled the hoop or had skate races down frozen canals in winter, Betsy sat and did dull grown-up things like embroidery. But Noli played as hard as anyone and wasn't much older than I, and it didn't seem fair that she should always do everything right. "Betsy," she was saying earnestly, "I'm not going to wear that great ugly hat to school just because Tante Jans paid for it. Last year it was that ugly gray one, and this year is even worse." Betsy looked at her sympathetically. "Well, but you can't go to school without a hat, and you know we can't afford another one." "We don't have to." With an anxious glance at the door, Noli dropped to her knees, reached beneath the single bed, which was all our tiny room would hold, and drew out a little round hat box. Inside nestled the smallest hat I had ever seen. It was of fur, with a blue satin ribbon for under the chin. "Oh, the darling thing!" Betsy lifted it reverently from the box and held it up to the patch of light that struggled into the room over the surrounding rooftops. "Where did you ever—" "Mrs. Van Diver gave it to me." The Van Divers owned the millinery shop 2 doors down. "She saw me looking at it, and later she brought it here just after Tante Jans picked out that." Noli pointed to the top of the wardrobe. A deep-rimmed brown bonnet with a cluster of lavender velvet roses proclaimed in every line the personage who had picked it out. Tante Jans. Mamma's older sister moved in with us when her husband died to spend, as she put it, what few days remained to me, though she was still only in her early 40s. Her coming had greatly complicated life in the old house, already crowded by the earlier arrivals of Mamma's other 2 sisters, Tante Bep and Tante Anna. Since along with Tante Jans had come quantities of furniture, all of it too large for the little rooms at the bayou. For her own use, Tante Jans took the 2 second-story rooms of the front house, directly over the watch shop and workroom. In the first room, she wrote the flaming Christian tracts for which she was known all over Holland, and in the second received the well-to-do ladies who supported this work. Tante Jans believed that our welfare in the hereafter depended on how much we could accomplish here on earth. For sleep she partitioned off a cubicle from her writing room, just large enough to hold a bed. Death, she often said, was waiting to snatch her from her work, and so she kept her hours of repose as brief and businesslike as possible. I could not remember life in the bayou before Tante Jans' arrival, nor whose these 2 rooms had been before. Above them was a narrow attic beneath the steep sloping roof of the first house. For as long as I could recall, this space had been divided into 4 truly miniature rooms, the first one, looking out over the Barteljorastraat, and the only one with a real window, was Tante Bep's. Behind it, strung like railroad compartments off a narrow aisle, were Tante Anna's, Betsy's, and our brother Willem's. 5 steps up from these rooms, in the second house behind, was Noli's and my small room. Beneath, our Mamma and Father's room, and beneath theirs, the dining room, with the kitchen tacked on like a afterthought to the side of it. I'm going to pause for a moment and show you a drawing of the house as she's describing it. Later I'll try to put a photograph on here of this drawing, but right for the moment, right now, here's the beginning. This is the shop, the watch shop. Here's their workroom. This is Tante Jans's 2 rooms. her writing room with the little bedroom off to the side. And then as she described, excuse me, there's Tante Bep's room there with the window overlooking the street. Then Tante Anna's and Willem's, or I believe that's Betsy's room there, and then Willem's. And then here was Corrie. Noli and Corrie's room there. And then Father and Mother's room here, and then the kitchen and the dining room here. So that way you'll have a better understanding of the layout. Now we return to our reading. If Tante Jan's share in this crowded house was remarkably large, it never seemed so to any of us living there. The world just naturally made place for Tante Jan's. All day long the horse-drawn trolley clopped and clanged past our house to stop at the Grote Market, the central town square half a block away. At least that was where it stopped for other people. When Tante Jan's wished to go somewhere, she stationed herself on the sidewalk directly in front of the watch shop door, and as the horses thundered close, held up a single-gloved finger. It looked to me more possible to stop the sun in the sky than to halt the charge of that trolley before its appointed place. But it stopped for Tante Jan's, brakes squealing, horses nearly falling over one another, and the driver tipped his tall hat as she swept aboard. And this was the commanding eye, past which Noli had to get that little fur hat. Tante Jan's had bought most of the clothing for us three girls since coming to live with us, but her gifts had a price. To Tante Jan's, the clothes and fashion when she was young represented God's final say on human apparel. All change since then came from the style book of the devil. Indeed, one of her best-known pamphlets exposed him as the inventor of the mutton sleeve and the bicycle skirt. "I know," I said as the button-hook in Betsy's swift fingers sped up my shoes. "You could fit the fur hat right inside the bonnet. Then when you get outside, take the bonnet off." "Corrie!" Noli was genuinely shocked. That wouldn't be honest." And with a baleful glance at the big brown hat, she picked up the little fur one and started after Betsy round the stairs down to breakfast. I picked up my own hat, the despised gray one from last year, and trailed after them, one hand clinging to the center post. Let Tante Jan see the silly hat then. I didn't care. I never could understand all the fuss over clothes. What I did understand, what was awful and alarming, was that this was the day I was to start school, to leave this old house above the watch shop, leave Mama and Father and the aunts, in fact, leave behind everything that was certain and well-loved. I gripped the post so tight that my palms squeaked as I circled around. The elementary school was only a block and a half away, it is true, and Noli had gone there 2 years without difficulty, but Noli was different from me. She was pretty and well-behaved and always had her handkerchief. And then, as I rounded the final curve, the solution came to me, so clear and simple that I laughed out loud. I just wouldn't go to school. I'd stay here and help Tante Anna with the cooking, and Mama would teach me to read, and I'd never go to that strange, ugly building at all. Relief and comfort flooded me, and I took the last 3 steps in a bound. Shh! Betsy and Noli were waiting for me outside the dining room door. For heaven's sake, Corrie, don't do anything to get Tante Jan's started wrong. Betsy said. I'm sure, she added doubtfully, that Father and Mother and Tante Anna will like Noli's hat. Tante Bep won't, I said. She never likes anything, Noli said, so she doesn't count. Tante Bep with her perpetual disapproving scowl, was the oldest of the aunts, and the one we children liked least. For 30 years she had worked as a governess in wealthy families, and she continually compared our behavior with that of the young ladies and gentlemen she was used to. Betsy pointed to the Frisian clock on the stair wall, and with a finger on her lips, silently opened the dining-room door. It was 8:12. Breakfast had already begun. 2 minutes late, cried Willem triumphantly. The Waller children were never late, said Tante Bep. But here they are, said Father, and the room is brighter. The three of us hardly heard. Tante Jan's chair was empty. Is Tante Jan staying in bed today? Asked Betsy hopefully as we hung our hats on the pegs. She's making herself a tonic in the kitchen, said Mamma. She leaned forward to pour our coffee and lowered her voice. We must all be especially considerate of dear Jans today. It's the day her husband's sister died some years ago. Or was it his cousin? I thought it was his aunt, said Tante Anna. It was his cousin, and it was a mercy, said Tante Bep. At any rate, Mamma hurried on, you know how these anniversaries upset dear Jans, so we must all try to make it up to her. Betsy cut 3 slices from the round loaf of bread, while I looked around the table trying to decide which adult would be most enthusiastic about my decision to stay at home. Father, I knew, put an almost religious importance on education. He himself had to stop school early to go to work in the watch shop, and though he had gone on to teach himself history, theology, and literature in 5 languages, he always regretted the missed schooling. He would want me to go, and whatever Father wanted, Mamma wanted too. Tante Anna, then. She'd often told me she couldn't manage without me to run errands up and down the steep stairs. Since Mamma was not strong, Tante Anna did most of the heavy housework for our family of 9. She was the youngest of the 4 sisters, with a spirit as generous as Mamma's own. There was a myth in our family, firmly believed by all, that Tante Anna received wages for this work, and indeed every Saturday Father faithfully paid her 1 guilder. But by Wednesday, when the greengrocer came, he often had to ask for it back, and she always had it, unspent and waiting. Yes, she would be my ally in this business. Tante Anna, I began, I've been thinking about you working so hard all day when I'm in school, and... A deep, dramatic intake of breath made us all look up. Tante Jans was standing in the kitchen doorway, a tumbler of thick brown liquid in her hand. When she had filled her chest with air, she closed her eyes, lifted the glass to her lips, and drained it down. Then, with a sigh, she let out the breath, set the glass on the sideboard, and sat down. And yet, she said, as though we had been discussing the subject, what do doctors know? Dr. Blinker prescribed this tonic, but what can medicine really do? What good does anything do when one's day arrives? I glanced around the table. No one was smiling. Tante Jan's preoccupation with death might have been funny, but it wasn't. Young as I was, I knew that fear is never funny. And yet, Jans, Father remonstrated gently, medicine has prolonged many a life. It didn't help Zusha, and she had the finest doctors in Rotterdam. It was this very day when she was taken, and she was no older than I am now, and got up and dressed for breakfast that day, just as I have. She was launching into a minute-by-minute account of Zusha's final day, when her eyes lit on the peg from which dangled Noli's new hat. "A fur muff?" she demanded, each word bristling with suspicion. "At this time of year?" "It isn't a muff, Tante Jans," said Noli in a small voice. "And is it possible to learn what it is?" It's a hat, Tante Jan's, Betsy answered for her. A surprise from Mrs. Van Diver. Wasn't it nice of... Oh, no! Nolly's hat has a brim, as a well-brought-up girl's should. I know. I bought and paid for it myself. There were flames in Tante Jan's eyes, tears in Nolly's, when Mamma came to the rescue. I'm not at all sure this cheese is fresh. She sniffed at the big pot of yellow cheese in the center of the table and pushed it across to Father. What do you think, Caspar? Father, who was incapable of practicing deceit or even recognizing it, took a long and earnest sniff. I'm sure it's perfectly fine, my dear. Fresh as the day it came. Mr. Steerwick's cheese is always... Catching Mamma's look as he stared from her to Jan's in confusion. Jan's, what do you think? Tante Jan seized the pot and glared into it with righteous zeal. If there was one subject which engaged her energies even more completely than modern clothing, it was spoiled food. At last, almost reluctantly it seemed to me, she approved the cheese. But the hat was forgotten. She had plunged into the sad story of an acquaintance, my very age, who had died after eating a questionable fish, when the shop people arrived and Father took down the heavy Bible from its shelf. There were only 2 employees in the watch shop in 1898, the clockman and Father's young apprentice, errand boy. When Mamma had poured their coffee, Father put on his rimless spectacles and began to read. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, and a light unto my path. Thou art my hiding place and my shield. I hope in thy word. What kind of hiding place? I wondered idly as I watched Father's brown beard rise and fall with the words. What was there to hide from? It was a long, long psalm. Beside me, Nolly began to squirm. When at last Father closed the big volume, she, Willem, and Betsy were on their feet in an instant and snatching up their hats. Next minute they had raced down at the last 5 stairs and out the alley door. More slowly, the 2 shop workers got up and followed them down the stairs to the shop's rear entrance. Only then did the 5 adults notice me still seated at the table. Corrie, cried Mamma, have you forgotten you're a big girl now? Today you go to school too. Hurry, or you must cross the street alone. I'm not going. There was a short, startled silence, broken by everybody at once. When I was a girl, Tante Jans began. Mrs. Walker's children, from Tante Bep, but Father's deep voice drowned them out. Of course she's not going alone. Nolly was excited today and forgot to wait, that's all. Corrie is going with me. And with that he took my hat from its peg, wrapped my hand in his, and led me from the room. My hand in Father's. That meant the windmill on the barn, or swans on the canal. But this time he was taking me to where I didn't want to go. There was a railing along the bottom 5 steps. I grabbed it with my free hand and held on. Skilled watchmaker's fingers closed over mine and gently unwound them. Howling and struggling, I was led away from the world I knew into a bigger, stranger, harder one. Mondays, Father took the train to Amsterdam to get the time from the Naval Observatory. Now that I had started school, it was only in the summer that I got to go with him. I would race downstairs to the shop, scrubbed, buttoned, and pronounced passable by Betsy. Father would be giving last-minute instructions to the apprentice. Mrs. Stahl will be in this morning to pick up her watch. This clock goes to the baker's in Bloomendale. And then we would be off to the station, hand in hand, I lengthening my strides and he shortening his to keep in step. The train trip to Amsterdam took only a half an hour, but it was a wonderful ride. First, the close-wedged buildings of old Haarlem gave way to separate houses with little plots of land around them. The spaces between the houses grew wider. And then we were in the country. The flat Dutch farmland stretching to the horizon, ruler-straight canals sweeping past the window. At last, Amsterdam, even bigger than Haarlem, with its bewilderment of strange streets and canals. Father always arrived a couple of hours before the time signal in order to visit the wholesalers who supplied him with watches and parts. Many of these were Jews, and these were the visits we both liked best. After the briefest possible discussion of business, Father would draw a small Bible from his traveling case. The wholesaler, whose beard would be even longer and fuller than Father's, would snatch a book or a scroll out of the drawer, clap a prayer cap onto his head, and the two of them would be off, arguing, comparing, interrupting, contradicting, reveling in each other's company. And then, just when I had decided that this time I had really been forgotten, the wholesaler would look up, catch sight of me as though for the first time, and strike his forehead with the heel of his hand. "A guest! A guest in my gates, and I have offered her no refreshment." And springing up, he would rummage under the shelves and into the cupboards. And before long, I would be holding on my lap a plate of the most delicious treats in the world, honey cakes and date cakes, and a kind of confection of nuts, fruits, and sugar. Desserts were rare in the Baye, sticky delights like these unknown. By 5 minutes before noon, we were always back at the train station, standing at a point on the platform from which we had a good view of the tower of the Naval Observatory. On the top of the tower, where it could be seen by all the ships in the harbor, was a tall shaft with two movable arms. At the stroke of 12 o'clock noon each day, the arms dropped. Father would stand at his vantage point on the platform, almost on tiptoe, with the joy of precision, holding his pocket watch and a pad and pencil. "There! 4 seconds fast!" Within an hour, the astronomical clock in the shop in Haarlem would be accurate to the second. On the train trip home, we no longer gazed out the window. Instead, we talked about different things as the years passed. Betsy's graduation from secondary school in spite of the months missed with illness. Whether Willem, when he graduated, would get the scholarship that would let him go to the university. Betsy starting work as Father's bookkeeper in the shop. Sometimes I would use the trip home to bring up things that were troubling me, since anything I asked at home was promptly answered by the aunts. Once, I must have been 10 or 11, I asked Father about a poem that we had read at school the winter before. One line had described a young man whose face was not shadowed by sexton. I had been far too shy to ask the teacher what it meant, and Mamma had blushed scarlet when I consulted her. In those days, just after the turn of the century, sex was never discussed, even at home. So the line had stuck in my head. Sex, I was pretty sure, meant whether you were a boy or a girl, and sin made Tante Jans very angry. But what the two together meant, I could not imagine. And so, seated next to Father in the train compartment, I suddenly asked, "Father, what is sex sin?" He turned to look at me as he always did when answering a question, but to my surprise he said nothing. At last he stood up, lifted his traveling case from the rack over our heads, and set it on the floor. "Will you carry it off the train, Corrie?" he said. I stood up and tugged at it. It was crammed with the watches and spare parts he had purchased that morning. "Oh, it's too heavy," I said. Yes, he said, and it would be a pretty poor father who would ask his little girl to carry such a load. It's the same way, Corrie, with knowledge. Some knowledge is too heavy for children. When you are older and stronger, you can bear it. For now, you must trust me to carry it for you. And I was satisfied, more than satisfied, wonderfully at peace. There were answers to this and all my hard questions, for now I was content to leave them in my father's keeping. Evenings at the Bayeux was always company and music. Guests would bring their flutes and violins, and as each member of the family sang or played an instrument, we made quite an orchestra gathered around the upright piano in Tante Jan's front room. The only evenings when we did not make our own music was when there was a concert in town. We could not afford tickets, but there was a stage door at the side of the concert hall through which sounds came clearly. There in the alley, outside this door, we and scores of other Harlem music lovers followed every note. Mama and Betsy were not strong enough to stand so many hours, but some of us from the Bayeux would be there in rain and snow and frost, and while from inside we would hear coughs and stirrings, there was never a rustle in the listeners at the door. Best of all was when there were concerts at the cathedral, because a relative was sexton there. Just inside this small private entrance, a wooden bench ran along the wall. Here we sat, our backs chilled by the ancient stone, our ears and hearts warmed by the music. The great golden organ was one that Mozart had played, and some of its notes seemed to come from heaven itself. Indeed, I was sure that heaven was like St. Bavo's, and probably about the same size. Hell, I knew, was a hot place, so heaven must be like this, cold, dank, holy building, where smoke rose like incense from the foot warmers of the paying customers. In heaven, I fervently believed everybody had foot warmers. Even in the summer, the chill never left the marble grave slabs on the floor. But when the organist touched the keys, we scarcely noticed. And when he played Bach, not at all. I was following Mama and Noli up a dark, straight flight of stairs where cobwebs clutched at our hair and mice scuttled away ahead of us. The building was less than a block from the Bayeux, and probably a century newer, but there was no Tante Anna to wax and scrub. We were going to see one of the many poor families in the neighborhood whom Mama had adopted. It never occurred to any of us children that we ourselves were poor. The poor were people you took baskets to. Mama was always cooking up nourishing broths and porridges for forgotten old men and pale young mothers. On days, that is, when she herself was strong enough to stand at the stove. The night before, a baby had died, and with a basket of her own fresh bread, Mama was making the prescribed call on the family. She toiled painfully up the railless stairs, stopping often for breath. At the top, a door opened into a single room that was obviously cooking, eating, and sleeping quarters all at once. There were already many visitors, most of them standing for lack of chairs. Mama went at once to the young mother, but I stood frozen on the threshold. Just to the right of the door, so still in the homemade crib, was the baby. It was strange that a society which hid the facts of sex from children made no effort to shield them from death. I stood staring at the tiny, unmoving form, with my heart thudding strangely against my ribs. Noli, always braver than I, stretched out her hand and touched the ivory white cheek. I longed to do it too, but hung back, afraid. For a while, curiosity and terror struggled in me. At last I put one finger on the small curled hand. It was cold. Cold as we walked back to the Bayeux, cold as I washed for supper, cold even in the snug gas-lit dining room. Between me and each familiar face around the table crept those small, icy fingers. For all Tante Jan's talk about it, death had been only a word. Now I knew that it could really happen. If to the baby, then to Mama, to Father, to Betsy. Still shivering with that cold, I followed Noli up to our room and crept into bed beside her. At last we heard Father's footsteps winding up the stairs. It was the best moment in every day when he came up to tuck us in. We never fell asleep until he had arranged the blankets in his special way and laid his hand for a moment on each head. Then we tried not to move, not even a toe. But that night, as he stepped through the door, I burst into tears. "I need you," I sobbed. "You can't die. You can't." Beside me on the bed, Noli sat up. "We want to see Mrs. Hoog," she explained. "Corrie didn't eat her supper or anything." Father sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. "Corrie," he began gently, "when you and I go to Amsterdam, when do I give you your ticket?" I sniffed a few times, considering this. "Why, just before we get on the train." "Exactly. And our wise Father in heaven knows when we're going to need things, too. Don't run out ahead of him, Corrie. When the time comes that some of us will have to die, you will look into your heart and find the strength you need. Just in time." And that's the end of chapter 2.